Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. Who is he really, Albus Dumbledore? At first glance, he seems like a kind old man, a wise mentor, one of the most powerful wizards of his time. But is his reputation truly so pure? Or is it hiding a much darker man who shamelessly used others to achieve his goals? The more I return to the Harry Potter books and films, the more I lean toward the second version. Dumbledore made choices that are hard to call good. Today I invite you to remember such moments and discuss them together. I hope you enjoy watching. Number 1. Constant lies. Dumbledore carefully hid his plans and knowledge even from his closest allies. Remember how Harry only learned the truth through Snape's memories, that both of them had been kept in the dark. Information was always fed in small, carefully controlled doses so no one saw the whole picture. Yes, you could argue it was a clever tactic to prevent Voldemort from anticipating every move, but the cost of that strategy was the disappointment and pain of those who trusted him. He deliberately misled them and sowed distrust among his allies. That style of leadership leaves a bitter aftertaste. Number 2, Harry and the Dursleys. People have often asked, why did Dumbledore leave Harry with the Dursleys? Why didn't he send him to someone in the Order of the Phoenix or bring him to Hogwarts? Yes, J.K. Rowling explained there was a magical reason, Lily's blood protection, but there's a far more troubling aspect. Albus knew perfectly well what Harry's life in that house was like. He was underfed, humiliated, forced to sleep in a cupboard under the stairs. Why didn't he try to ease the boy's suffering? Why allow it to go on for years? Was this some twisted lesson to toughen Harry up? If so, it's a cruel method for someone who calls himself the defender of good. Number 3, used teenagers in his plans. Dumbledore was an adult and an extremely powerful wizard. He had many allies in the Order of the Phoenix. Yet he often gave key assignments to children. Harry received the most dangerous tasks, retrieving Slughorn's memory, destroying Horcruxes, and ultimately facing Voldemort himself. Theoretically, adult Order members could have handled these. You could argue the teenagers volunteered, but is that really an excuse? This wasn't some adventurous game, it was war, and he put the burden of fulfilling the prophecy on them. That approach seems irresponsible and even cynical. Number 4. Prepared Harry for slaughter. One of the most shocking moments is the truth Harry discovers through Snape's memories. Dumbledore never told him outright that the only way to defeat Voldemort was for Harry to sacrifice himself. Even Snape was horrified by the cold calculation. You have kept him alive so that he can die at the proper moment. You have been raising him like a pig for slaughter. All those final years, Dumbledore's priority was simply ensuring Harry would live long enough to die when it was strategically useful. From a military perspective, you might call that necessary, but from the perspective of a man who was supposed to be Harry's mentor and protector, it is chillingly cold-blooded. Number 5. Ignored Harry. After the traumatic events of the Triwizard Tournament, Harry was in a terrible state. He was traumatized, smeared in the press, the Ministry denied Voldemort's return, and many Hogwarts students turned against him. Who stood by him? Ron and Hermione, his loyal friends. But Dumbledore? Throughout Order of the Phoenix, he actively avoided Harry. He even asked Harry's friends to hold back and not tell him anything important. Later, he justified it by saying he wanted to protect Harry from Voldemort's influence. But was there truly no way to at least let Harry know he wasn't alone? That method didn't just seem odd, it was cruel to deny a child support precisely when he needed it most. Number 6. Memory manipulation. Dumbledore knew exactly how much shame Horace Slughorn carried. He knew the memory of that evening with Tom Riddle was buried under layers of guilt, but instead of offering comfort, he used it as leverage. In Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore tells Harry, "I would ask you to do this for me, to get the true memory." It sounded gentle, but it was an order. Slughorn had spent years trying to forget how he told a teenage Tom about Horcruxes. Dumbledore could have spoken with honesty, could have explained why the memory mattered. Instead, he set Harry loose with nothing but Slughorn's fear and remorse as weapons. When Slughorn finally gave in, his face was wet with tears. He whispered, "Don't think badly of me." But Dumbledore already had. A true mentor would have protected Slughorn from that kind of humiliation. Dumbledore chose to exploit it. He knew no spell could force the memory free, so he relied on a subtler kind of magic, emotional manipulation. He turned a man's regret into a tool to finish his own mission. After it was over, he never apologized. He never thanked Slughorn for reliving the worst mistake of his life. Dumbledore just stored the memory away, another secret in his collection, and moved on to the next task. Number 7, treatment of his younger brother. Aberforth Dumbledore spent most of his life in the Hog's Head, surrounded by goats and gossip. People whispered that he was simple, that he lacked the brilliance of his famous brother. But no one ever asked how much of that reputation was planted by Albus himself. When Ariana died, Aberforth shattered. He stood in the hall at her funeral and screamed at Albus for chasing power while their sister wasted away. Albus never spoke of it again. He buried the story as deep as he could. In Deathly Hallows, Aberforth spits, "He never really cared about her." Those words were raw truth. Albus preferred to pretend Aberforth did not exist. He built his legend as the wise headmaster, the champion of Muggleborns, the vanquisher of Grindelwald. In that story, there was no room for the angry brother who knew his secrets. No room for the man who had seen him at his most selfish. Even when Harry finally met Aberforth, the old barman still carried the weight of Albus's pride. He hadn't forgiven him. Dumbledore never tried to heal that wound. He hid behind the mask of a perfect mentor, while the only family he had left became a stranger he wouldn't claim. Number 8. Indifference to Sirius Black's fate. Sirius Black spent 12 years in Azkaban for a crime he didn't commit. Dumbledore knew Peter Pettigrew had betrayed the Potters. He even suspected the truth the night they died. Yet he never lifted a wand to demand a trial for Sirius. He let the Ministry lock him away among Dementors while Remus Lupin mourned and Harry grew up without family. When Sirius finally escaped, Dumbledore's help was cautious, even cold. He told Harry, "You must understand that the Ministry does not see Sirius as an innocent man." But he was the most powerful wizard in Britain. He could have spoken for Sirius in front of the Wizengamot. Instead, he kept quiet. He needed Sirius free to house Harry and support the Order, but not so free as to draw too much attention. Dumbledore used others to handle the dirty work. It was Hermione's time-turner, Harry's courage, and Buckbeak's wings that saved Sirius, not any plan of the headmasters. Even afterward, Sirius was trapped in Grimmauld Place under Dumbledore's orders, pacing like a prisoner in his own home, cut off from the world he wanted to rejoin. To Dumbledore, Sirius was a resource, a member of the Order when needed, a guardian for Harry when convenient. But justice for the man clearing his name? That was a battle Dumbledore never chose to fight. And Sirius paid the price with his freedom and, finally, his life. Number 9. Attitude toward Slytherin students. Slytherin House was always marked with suspicion. Students wore green and silver like a curse. Dumbledore, the wise and patient headmaster, let that bias fester for years. He watched as the school divided itself into heroes and villains, no real effort to build bridges, no speeches about unity that mattered. The message was clear. Slytherins were dangerous, and that was that. Look at Draco Malfoy in Half-Blood Prince, forced into Voldemort's service, ordered to kill or see his family destroyed. Dumbledore knew every detail. He even told Snape, "You must be the one to kill me, Severus." He was willing to die to save Draco's soul, but he never once sat Draco down to offer help or comfort. He let the boys spiral into terror and rage. Imagine what it felt like for Draco. pretending he was strong enough for murder, desperate to protect Narcissa and Lucius. Dumbledore let him carry that burden alone, not because he was powerless, but because he chose to. He treated Draco like a piece in his last, tragic gambit. Other Slytherins got the same cold shoulder, no encouragement to defy Voldemort's legacy, no guidance to choose another path. It was easier for Dumbledore to let them fill their roles in the war. Villains make the story simple, heroes need enemies, and he was always the master storyteller. Number 10. Questionable teaching standards. Hogwarts was supposed to be the safest place in the wizarding world, yet under Dumbledore's watch, danger walked the corridors with a staff badge. Take Gilderoy Lockhart, a fraud who couldn't perform a single reliable charm. Dumbledore knew it. In Chamber of Secrets, McGonagall says sharply, "You mean to tell me that this boy has discovered the secret of the chamber before you, Lockhart?" Dumbledore watched Lockhart bungle lesson after lesson, while students learned nothing but fear. Why hire him at all? Dumbledore wasn't blind. He knew Lockhart's fame was built on obliviate spells. It was as if he wanted the children to see through the glamour and learn a hard truth about the world. But at what cost? Harry and Ron nearly died in the chamber. Ginny Weasley was possessed, all while Lockhart babbled and posed. And it wasn't only Lockhart. Remember Quirrell, literally possessed by Voldemort. Dumbledore hired a man who kept the Dark Lord on the back of his head. He must have suspected something. Even Snape, ever vigilant, watched Quirrell constantly. Yet Dumbledore let it play out. Was it strategy, a test, or negligence so grand it became cruelty? These were not mere oversights, they were choices. He let dangerous teachers in, he let them stay. He let students face threats they could barely comprehend. Dumbledore always had a reason, but try telling that to the terrified first years who thought safety meant Hogwarts. Number 11. Double standards in justice. Dumbledore always claimed to stand for justice, but his choices told a different story. He brought Severus Snape back to Hogwarts, a man who had once served Voldemort without question. Snape was forgiven so completely that his past became a forbidden topic. Students whispered rumors, but Dumbledore gave him power over children and refused to explain why. In The Half-Blood Prince, he says simply, "I trust Severus Snape completely." That was enough. For Dumbledore, his redemption was absolute truth. Meanwhile, Igor Karkaroff faced a different fate. He came before the Wizengamot in Goblet of Fire, pleading to prove he was done with the Dark Lord. Dumbledore watched, cold and silent. Karkaroff named names to save himself, true, but Snape had done worse, and yet no one in Britain got the same second chance. Dumbledore dismissed Karkaroff as a coward, not worth saving. His mercy was not a principle, it was a weapon he wielded for his own plans. Snape's loyalty was convenient. He provided essential information. He was Dumbledore's own personal spy. So the headmaster protected him, even when Snape tormented students and spread fear in the classroom. Remember how he treated Harry, how he humiliated Neville Longbottom? Dumbledore let it continue because it served his grand design. The justice he claimed to uphold stopped at the edge of his strategy. That's the truth of it. Dumbledore picked and chose who deserved forgiveness. He turned a blind eye to Snape's cruelty, but showed no compassion for those he couldn't use. He wore fairness like a cloak, but underneath lay a mind that judged people not by what they had done, but by how they might help him win his war. Number 12. Exploiting the Order of the Phoenix. Albus Dumbledore gathered the Order of the Phoenix with grand promises of fighting Voldemort together, but he kept them in the dark about the real plan. Molly Weasley spent nights worrying about her children without knowing what they were truly facing. Remus Lupin risked his life on missions while Dumbledore withheld the prophecy that made Harry the center of everything. "You are the only one who can kill him, Harry," Dumbledore would admit only to the boy, not to the adults laying down their lives on his orders. It wasn't strategy, it was manipulation. Sirius Black paid the highest price for that secrecy. Trapped in Grimmauld Place, he went mad with frustration. He wanted to fight, but didn't know Dumbledore's true intentions. "I want to be on the front line," Sirius said in Order of the Phoenix, his voice raw with anger. But Dumbledore dismissed him, letting him rot in the house that killed him long before Bellatrix did. The old wizard gave orders, demanded loyalty, but offered no truth. Kingsley Shacklebolt followed instructions with military precision, yet even he, Auror, and Spy in the Ministry didn't know the ultimate plan. Dumbledore used Kingsley's calm authority to keep the Order obedient, but when push came to shove, he never gave him the whole picture. "Trust Dumbledore" became a mantra everyone repeated without questioning. They didn't realize they were pawns on his private chessboard. This was no humble leader burdened by secrets for the greater good. This was a commander who exploited the faith of friends. Even when Remus Lupin begged for answers about protecting Harry, Dumbledore fed him scraps of information. He told Snape more than he told the Order. He controlled knowledge like currency, and they all paid for it in blood. Number 13. Cruel Test for Snape. Albus Dumbledore, so often celebrated as the champion of light and mercy, cast a shadow far darker than many dared to acknowledge when it came to Severus Snape. This was not the mentorship of a forgiving teacher, lifting a lost man from ruin, but the forging of a chain of guilt so heavy it bent Snape's spirit to the ground. After Lily Potter's death, Snape collapsed before Dumbledore, pleading to save her son as penance for his own betrayal. But the great headmaster, that beacon of hope, offered no absolution, only a pact sealed in perpetual punishment. J.K. Rowling wrote in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, "You disgust me," Dumbledore said coldly when Snape tried to protest about protecting the boy. This moment laid bare the truth. Snape would be useful, but he would never be allowed to forget what he had done. It was Dumbledore's design to keep Snape in the shadows, shunned by the staff, hated by the students. He could have revealed Snape's loyalty, granting him the redemption he so desperately craved, but he chose secrecy instead, ensuring that the man who had betrayed the Potter's hiding place would forever be cast as villain. The price of this secrecy was Snape's humanity itself, which Dumbledore spent like coin to buy Harry's safety. In the Deathly Hallows, Dumbledore coolly informed Snape, "You will have to tell me if Voldemort ever possesses the boy again." There was no apology, no comfort, only orders and obligations piled higher and higher. Snape's existence at Hogwarts became a daily crucible. Forced to sneer and punish Harry, he was both shield and blade, protecting the boy while goading him into defiance that would keep Voldemort's suspicions at bay. Dumbledore's plan demanded that Snape wear the mask of the Death Eater, an unredeemed monster. He knew how hated Snape was, but that was part of the plan's elegance. No one would suspect the truth. This manipulation was chilling in its precision. In Half-Blood Prince, when Harry shouted that Snape was a coward, Snape didn't flinch because he was bound by Dumbledore's command never to reveal the truth, forced to swallow the insult to maintain the illusion. Dumbledore never once offered Snape a way out. There was no mercy in the arrangement, only necessity. He required Snape's skill at occlumency to stand before Voldemort without betraying the Order. He needed Snape's insight to decode the enemy's plans, but he also needed Snape's unending guilt as fuel. In Deathly Hallows, Snape spat at Dumbledore's plan for Harry to die. "You have kept him alive so that he can die at the right moment?" This moment revealed the raw truth. Snape was horrified not just by Harry's fate, but by the role he himself had been forced to play in grooming the boy for sacrifice. Even Snape's vow to protect Draco Malfoy was another of Dumbledore's twisted bargains. He cornered Snape into the unbreakable vow with Narcissa, knowing full well it might kill him, yet used Snape as a failsafe to protect Draco's soul from murder. Snape would be forced to commit the act himself, ensuring his own damnation. In Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore said, "Severus, please." That plea was no forgiveness. It was a command to end his life, to save Draco's, to save the plan, to turn Snape into a murderer at last, so the child would not become one. Snape's teaching post was another cage disguised as favour. He was allowed to return to Hogwarts only under Dumbledore's absolute authority. The school became his prison, filled with people who despised him and students who mocked him. Every day he taught children whose parents had died fighting on the other side, forced to be the man no one trusted, so that when the time came, he would have the perfect alibi before Voldemort. There was no chance for Snape to rebuild a life he was too valuable broken. As Rowling wrote, he was Dumbledore's man through and through, but at what cost? Harry himself was a pawn in this game, and Dumbledore admitted it with chilling calm. In Deathly Hallows he said, "You were the 7th Horcrux, Harry, the Horcrux he never meant to make." The only way to end Voldemort was for Harry to die. And Snape was the man chosen to keep Harry alive just long enough to groom him to his fate, to send him toward death with no understanding of what awaited him. Snape raged at this betrayal, not just of Harry, but of his own conscience, forced to work for an outcome he could barely stomach. Even the so-called redemption Dumbledore offered Snape was not truly his to give. There was no ceremony, no absolution, no moment when Snape was told he was forgiven for his crimes. There was only the ongoing debt. He would pay for Lily's death with his life's work, but he would never be allowed to feel it was enough. In Deathly Hallows, Dumbledore said of Snape's enduring love for Lily, "You have been remarkably consistent." But he did not say it kindly. It was an observation, a reminder of the reasons Snape could never be free. Dumbledore's control over Snape extended even beyond his own death. He planned for Snape to become headmaster, to maintain the illusion of loyalty to Voldemort while protecting students as best he could. But even this was a poisoned gift. Snape was forced to preside over Hogwarts while it became a nest of carrows, tasked with shielding children from torture while pretending to allow it. He was despised as Voldemort's puppet, even as he risked his life to subvert the Death Eater's rule. Dumbledore's plan gave Snape power, but only in service of his unending guilt. Number 14. Secrets about the Horcruxes. Albus Dumbledore was never a man who spoke plainly, and nowhere was this clearer than in the way he managed the secret of the Horcruxes. He discovered their existence long before Harry Potter did, but rather than sharing everything, he let the knowledge trickle out in half-truths and cryptic hints. He told Harry that Voldemort had split his soul. That much was certain, but he refused to say outright where the Horcruxes were or how many truly remained. When Harry asked, Dumbledore would stare into the distance, blue eyes thoughtful, and offer something like, "Voldemort was, I think, most afraid of death," as if that explained everything. Even when he revealed the diary and the ring as destroyed Horcruxes, he did not explain the full method. He never wrote down instructions for Harry, never gave him a clear list of locations or objects to destroy. It was as though Dumbledore needed Harry to suffer through the guessing game, to learn the hard way what Dumbledore already knew. Consider the sword of Godric Gryffindor, a blade that absorbed the basilisk venom from the Chamber of Secrets. Dumbledore understood the sword's properties perfectly. He knew it could destroy Horcruxes because it had imbibed something so deadly that it could overcome the protections Voldemort used. But when the time came, Dumbledore did not tell Harry, Ron, or Hermione outright. Instead, he allowed them to figure it out themselves in a frozen forest, starving and alone, with Ron nearly drowning in an icy pool to retrieve it. Dumbledore had left them. Only the faintest guidance in his will, bequeathing the sword to Harry without explanation, knowing it would be intercepted and withheld by the Ministry. One might argue he wanted them to prove themselves worthy of it, but others would say he was willing to gamble their lives on a riddle that he had the answer to all along. Even worse was the secret of the diadem. Dumbledore suspected the lost diadem of Ravenclaw was one of the Horcruxes, as he told Harry in his office while tracing the lines of his pensieve. Yet even in these supposed lessons, Dumbledore was evasive. He never told Harry that he had been to Borgin and Burke's to see the cup, or that he had tracked down Hepzibah Smith's murder. He shared just enough to keep Harry hungry for answers. By the time Harry, Ron and Hermione realized the diadem was hidden in the room of requirement, they had lost months, even years, to false leads and panicked guesses. "I have been hoping for better reasons," Dumbledore admitted, but this hope meant leaving teenagers to decipher clues that cost lives, Dobby's, Fred's, and countless others during the final battle at Hogwarts. Dumbledore also never wrote anything down that might have helped. No journal, no letter with clear instructions, no map or list of suspected Horcruxes, despite having researched them for decades. He kept everything locked in his own mind, as if knowledge was too dangerous to trust to parchment. But the result was that when he died on the astronomy tower, struck down by Severus Snape in a plan they both had agreed upon, Harry was left with a partial roadmap at best. Harry had to rely on broken memories and fleeting hunches to hunt down Voldemort's Horcruxes. Ron and Hermione were equally lost. They spent long, cold nights in forests arguing about what Dumbledore might have meant, poring over fragments of information like monks deciphering an ancient code. It was not merely that Dumbledore was forgetful or careless. He deliberately chose opacity. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, he said, "I make mistakes like the next man. In fact, being rather cleverer than most men, my mistakes tend to be correspondingly huger." It was an admission not of ignorance, but of pride. His strategy depended on letting Harry suffer so he would truly understand sacrifice. Dumbledore may have believed that if Harry were given clear instructions, he might never mature into the sort of leader the fight required. Yet this belief cost them time, friends, and safety. Harry himself never stopped asking why Dumbledore had withheld so much. He would remember the portrait's vague smiles in the headmaster's office and feel anger, even betrayal, despite his reverence for the old man. Dumbledore's approach to Harry's education about Horcruxes was also marked by a cold, almost manipulative patience. He fed Harry memories in the pensive piece by piece, letting him watch Caractacus Burke's recollection of the locket, or Hepzibah Smith bragging about her treasures. But he left critical gaps unfilled. He did not tell Harry that he suspected Nagini was a Horcrux. He did not explain how many Horcruxes there might be until they had destroyed 2, even though he had told Voldemort that 7 was the magical number of splits Voldemort aimed for. When Harry asked, Dumbledore would lean back, steepling his fingers, his voice musing. It was a teacher's trick, force the student to reach the conclusion on his own, but they were not preparing for an exam. They were trying to prevent a second genocide. Consider Hermione Granger's frantic research sessions in the tent while they were on the run. She pored over Secrets of the Darkest Art, the same book Dumbledore must have read. She realized for herself that basilisk venom destroyed Horcruxes completely because it was so destructive it prevented the fragment of soul from clinging to life. Yet Dumbledore had witnessed this process when Harry stabbed Tom Riddle's diary in the Chamber of Secrets years before. He never explained the connection. He let Hermione struggle toward the answer in terror and isolation, pursued by snatchers, hunted by Death Eaters. Even when he spoke to Harry in King's Cross, dead but not dead, he admitted only then, "I was too fond of you." Fond but willing to make a chess piece of the boy. Number 15. Deadly Traditions at Hogwarts. Under Dumbledore's long reign as headmaster, Hogwarts became a place where death and disaster lurked in its ancient stones. The school, advertised as a safe haven for magical learning, routinely forced children into mortal danger. Consider the Chamber of Secrets. When the basilisk began petrifying students, the fear that gripped Hogwarts was not some abstract threat, but a very real risk of death. Yet Albus Dumbledore, the man who claimed to value every student, did not shut the school or evacuate the children. He allowed the term to continue despite knowing from Tom Riddle's own past that the chamber had opened before and claimed a life. Dumbledore's inaction raises questions about what he considered acceptable sacrifice in the pursuit of education. Hogwarts itself was a museum of hazards masquerading as tradition. The Forbidden Forest, full of centaurs, giant spiders, werewolves, and even the monstrous Acromantula colony, was explicitly off-limits but simultaneously used as a punishment ground. When Draco Malfoy, Harry Potter, Hermione Granger, and Neville Longbottom were caught out of bed, they were sent with Hagrid into that forest to search for a dangerous creature. Harming unicorns. It is astonishing that this was not only allowed, but structured as a disciplinary measure. This institutionalized risk suggests that Dumbledore either underestimated the lethal potential of the forest or accepted it as a rite of passage. Dumbledore's penchant for these dark traditions extended into academics. Care of magical creatures lessons included hippogriffs, creatures whose pride was so easily wounded that one student, Draco Malfoy, was slashed across the arm for failing to bow properly. Hagrid, the gamekeeper-turned-teacher, was unsupervised in introducing these volatile animals. While some students found the lessons thrilling, they were taught no real safety protocols besides bow and hope. Dumbledore not only permitted this, but appointed Hagrid to the post. Knowing full well his affection for dangerous creatures, it was not merely an oversight, it was a deliberate pedagogical choice that risked maiming children in the name of magical education. There is also the Triwizard Tournament, resurrected in Harry's 4th year. This event had been banned for centuries because too many students had died. Dumbledore himself acknowledged its dangers. The Triwizard Tournament's history is littered with corpses. Despite this, he agreed to host it at Hogwarts. Though nominally reformed, the task still involved dragons, underwater rescue missions with real drowning potential, and a hedge maze filled with enchantments designed to terrorize and injure. Dumbledore spoke solemnly about the importance of international cooperation, but one must wonder what kind of cooperation requires risking teenage lives. More damning is the fact that Harry Potter, underage and never having entered his name, was forced to compete by an unbreakable magical contract. Instead of finding a way to nullify this trap, clearly designed by dark forces, Dumbledore let Harry participate. He may have suspected the tournament was compromised given the Death Eater presence at Hogwarts, yet he let it proceed. When Cedric Diggory was murdered, Dumbledore accepted the responsibility, but it was too late. By sanctioning the tournament at all, he gambled with his students' lives. Dumbledore's pattern of dangerous leniency becomes even clearer when examining his approach to Tom Riddle. He met the boy in Wool's orphanage and immediately sensed the darkness in him. Yet instead of warning others or setting strict boundaries, he allowed Riddle to attend Hogwarts without any real intervention in his disturbing behavior. Riddle experimented in the Forbidden Forest, opened the chamber, and created Horcruxes. Dumbledore noticed all of this over the years but chose observation over prevention. In prioritizing the idea that all children deserved a chance, he enabled the worst dark wizard since Grindelwald to rise. Even his treatment of Harry is revealing. Harry was marked for death from infancy, his blood protection known to be fragile at best. Dumbledore deliberately kept him ignorant of key truths until the final hour. He withheld the prophecy details, the Horcrux secret, and Harry's own role as a sacrificial lamb. Dumbledore's philosophy, expressed bluntly in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, was that it is the power of choice that matters most. Yet Harry's choices were manufactured by deliberate withholding of information. Dumbledore cultivated Harry as a weapon while maintaining the facade of caring mentor. The Hogwarts curriculum itself reflected this perilous philosophy. Students were taught spells that could kill or torture. Avada Kedavra and the Cruciatus Curse appeared in defense against the dark arts lessons under Moody, really Barty Crouch Jr. Though Dumbledore didn't know Moody was an imposter, he did not afterward change the teaching approach. Defense against the dark arts remained a subject where fear and aggression were integral to learning. Dumbledore valued preparation for a dark world more than he valued sheltering his charges from that darkness. Consider, too, the constant threat of infiltration under Dumbledore's leadership. Quirrell harboured Voldemort in his head in Harry's first year with the Philosopher's Stone as bait. The protections around the stone were described as ingenious, yet they were also an invitation to test talented students like Harry, Hermione, and Ron. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Dumbledore praised the trio's courage instead of condemning the circumstances that required it. His praise for risk-taking was part of Hogwarts culture, a belief that courage is forged in fire, regardless of the burns it inflicts. Dumbledore's moral reasoning often used grand abstractions to justify specific dangers. He told Harry in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix that youth cannot know how age thinks and feels, but old men are guilty if they forget what it was to be young. This acknowledgement of his mistakes was moving but did not change his methods. Hogwarts remained a battleground for children. One might argue that war was coming, so Dumbledore prepared them. But that preparation was not just education. It was live combat training in a setting that pretended to be a school. Number 16, choosing Harry as the Messiah. Albus Dumbledore's choices were always cloaked in the shimmering veil of wisdom, compassion, and sacrifice, but a closer look reveals the disturbing precision of a general sacrificing pawns for a final victory. From the moment he discovered Sybil Trelawney's prophecy, the one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, Dumbledore chose to make Harry the living answer to that riddle, not as a child to protect, but as a weapon to be primed. He did not seek out alternatives in ancient magical texts, nor did he convene the world's magical scholars to explore soul magic or non-violent containment of Voldemort. He locked onto a single, chilling solution. Harry must die at the right moment so Voldemort could be mortal once more. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore explains to Snape, "You know his soul is not whole. You know what he must do." The coldness in that strategy is hard to deny. He knew Harry would need to die, yet he spent years moulding him to accept it as duty. Dumbledore understood magic better than any wizard of his age. He was a scholar of ancient runes, an alchemist who worked with Nicholas Flamel, and a man with enough influence to consult the archives of any magical culture. He could have searched for lost Egyptian spells rumoured to cleanse souls, or the arcane mind rituals of the East that separated evil without blood sacrifice. But he did not. Instead, he carefully curated Harry's education to ensure the boy would be brave enough, loyal enough, and self-sacrificing to go to his death willingly. When Harry asks in Deathly Hallows, was it all for the greater good? The question resonates far beyond the surface. Dumbledore had, in essence, become the architect of Harry's destiny without ever giving him the real freedom to choose another path. Consider the way Dumbledore withheld the full prophecy from Harry until their meeting in his office at the end of Order of the Phoenix. He chose that moment, after Sirius's death, to break Harry's spirit into accepting the harsh truth. Dumbledore says in the book, "I cared more for your happiness than your knowing the truth." But in truth, he was ensuring Harry was too traumatized and guilty to refuse the role he'd been cast in. The timing is surgical, designed to make Harry see no choice but to continue on the road paved for him. The old man in the purple cloak was no naive grandfather figure here. He was a master strategist who knew precisely how much pain was necessary to keep Harry compliant. Even Harry's early years at Hogwarts were manipulated for this end. Dumbledore allowed Harry to face Voldemort's remnant in his first year. He let an 11-year-old fight a fully grown wizard's shade, supposedly to give him the chance to fight his own battles. But this was more than trusting courage. It was training. Harry was being conditioned to see life and death duels as normal, to accept his own mortality, to associate sacrifice with love and virtue. In Philosopher's Stone, Dumbledore praises him. "To one as young as you, I say only this. You did the thing your mother did. You gave yourself. He plants the seeds that dying for others is the highest calling, softening him for the ultimate act decades later. The manipulation extends to Dumbledore's treatment of other allies. Severus Snape is coerced through grief and guilt into protecting Harry while preparing him to die. Dumbledore doesn't comfort the grieving potions master but uses his love for Lily Potter as leverage, ensuring Snape's compliance in the cold plan. When Snape protests the idea that Harry is being raised like a pig for slaughter, Dumbledore's answer is not denial but rationalization. Don't tell me now that you've grown to care for the boy. This exchange in Deathly Hallows is a window into the elder wizard's calculating soul. He never disputes that Harry is a sacrificial lamb, only that it is necessary. This cold, strategic mind is also revealed in how he structures the Order of the Phoenix. Members are kept on a need-to-know basis, even when sharing could have saved lives. Dumbledore keeps his secrets close, even from allies like Kingsley Shacklebolt and Remus Lupin, who might have offered alternatives if they understood the prophecy's full meaning. Instead, he isolates information so no one can derail his plan for Harry's death. There is no council of wise wizards debating ethical solutions, only Dumbledore in his tower, convinced of his righteousness. One might argue Dumbledore is a tragic figure, aware of his darkness but seeing no other way. He admits his failures to Harry in King's Cross, confessing that he craved power in youth and feared himself too much to wield it. Yet even this scene feels like the final manipulation, a posthumous confession that unburdens his conscience while reinforcing Harry's readiness to finish the task. He offers sympathy and remorse, but never an apology for making the boy into a martyr. He ensures Harry leaves that liminal space prepared to face death again, fulfilling Dumbledore's design. The idea that Dumbledore could have explored other magical solutions is not idle fantasy. The wizarding world is filled with lost arts and cultures. The Department of Mysteries houses rooms dedicated to the study of death, time, love, and the mind. Dumbledore was the only wizard Voldemort feared, a master duelist and legilimens who could have led an international effort to discover a way to purge a Horcrux from a living soul. Instead, he chose not to try, convinced the human cost was unavoidable. His brilliance became a prison. He saw only one path and forced Harry to walk it. Dumbledore's calculated nurturing of Harry's self-sacrificing tendencies is also apparent in his teaching style. He gives Harry the Sword of Gryffindor, reinforcing the boy's image of himself as a hero and martyr. He sends him to Slughorn in Half-Blood Prince to extract the Horcrux memory, essentially using Harry's charm and moral compass to manipulate a broken old man. Harry doesn't realize it, but Dumbledore is already laying the groundwork for his death by ensuring the Horcrux hunt continues unimpeded. Every lesson is a step toward the grave. The will Dumbledore leaves behind is the final testimony to his strategy. He bequeaths Harry the snitch that will only open at the close, ensuring Harry has the resurrection stone for his walk to die. It is not an heirloom, but a key to death, a psychological aid to soothe him as he accepts his fate. Even in death, Dumbledore controls Harry's steps, making sure the boy does exactly what he was bred to do. This is not care, it is design, a chess player moving his last piece into checkmate. Dumbledore's image as the kind mentor is also protected by his careful control of information. He ensures McGonagall, a powerful witch in her own right, never knows the full plan because she would have resisted. He shields Harry from learning the truth too soon, knowing the boy's compassion might rebel against his own murder. Even Sirius Black is kept in the dark, used as emotional leverage and then discarded by fate. The old man's kindly twinkle hid an iron will willing to sacrifice anyone so long as the Dark Lord fell. There are moments in the books when Harry senses this manipulation but cannot articulate it. After Dobby's death, After seeing countless friends die at Hogwarts, he realizes the horror of being the chosen one. When he walks into the forest to die, the narrative is suffused with quiet rage and resignation. He has no other way. Even Voldemort, in his perverse honesty, never lies to Harry about killing him. It is Dumbledore who deceives with love, making Harry believe there is glory in dying young. Harry's final acceptance of his fate is often celebrated as ultimate bravery, but it is also the result of years of grooming. He is told repeatedly by mentors that sacrifice is his duty. Lupin, Tonks, Fred Weasley all die in the final battle Dumbledore set in motion, deaths Harry must carry as proof of the war's moral cost. It is not only Harry who pays, but an entire generation of Hogwarts students forced into a war they did not choose. Dumbledore's plan had no room for the possibility that Harry might refuse to participate. He made sure that option never existed. Even the Deathly Hallows, which might have saved Harry without his death, are framed as a moral test. Dumbledore deliberately ensures Harry cannot master them all without accepting mortality. He gives him just enough to win, but not to survive untouched. When Harry asks in King's Cross if he is truly dead, Dumbledore hedges, refusing to promise him anything but more duty. The Elder Wand, the stone, the cloak, all are traps reinforcing the inevitability of sacrifice. This shade of darkness in Dumbledore does not negate his heroism, but it demands honesty. He was willing to kill a child, however gently he steered him there. He ensured Voldemort's destruction, but at the cost of Harry's innocence and freedom. He never truly offered a choice, only the illusion of one. For all his wisdom, he could not imagine a world where love triumphed without blood, where a boy could live without being forged into a weapon. And in the end, that is Dumbledore's sin, the belief that the end justifies any means, even the sacrifice of the one he claimed to love most. Number 17. Attitude toward House Elves. Albus Dumbledore was hailed as the most enlightened wizard of his age, a champion of tolerance who defeated Gellert Grindelwald and resisted Lord Voldemort's tyranny, yet in the kitchens of Hogwarts he presided over an ancient system of servitude that remained untouched under his long leadership. The House Elves laboured in silence, conjuring meals and scrubbing floors, bound by old magic and older expectations, and Dumbledore's approach to their plight was marked by an unsettling complacency. He was a man who insisted on seeing nuance in everyone, even Voldemort, but when it came to elves, he seemed to accept that they like being enslaved. The contradiction was woven into the castle itself, an irony so brazen it could only hide in plain sight. Students ate feasts prepared by invisible workers, and the headmaster, wise and twinkling-eyed, did little more than comment on their good nature. Even when Hermione Granger founded SPEW, the Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare, Dumbledore greeted it with tolerant amusement, suggesting she was being idealistic without offering her meaningful support. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, Hermione is described as knitting hats for house elves and leaving them around Gryffindor Tower to be picked up. But while students mocked her, Dumbledore, who knew every secret of his school, never intervened to help. Instead, he acknowledged the elves' loyalty as though it were a quaint tradition, never mind the forced magic that bound them. In his office, behind portraits and phoenixes, the question of elvish freedom never truly arose. The contrast between his reputation as a reformer and his inaction toward elf servitude is a shadow on the shining legend of Hogwarts' greatest headmaster. Kreacher, the Black Family elf, offered a glimpse into the system's cruelty. Bound by magic to serve Sirius Black even while despising him, Kreacher was treated with open contempt, and his loyalty was twisted, not freely given. Dumbledore knew Kreacher's condition, knew the toxic family traditions that warped him, yet never questioned the underlying structure that forced Kreacher's service. He accepted the bond as a fact of wizarding society. It was Sirius who mistreated Kreacher cruelly, yes, but the institution that made such abuse inevitable went unchallenged. Dumbledore The master strategist, who planned Voldemort's downfall years in advance, showed no sign of planning anything for elf liberation. Even when Creature's knowledge proved vital to the Order of the Phoenix, his enslavement remained unchanged, a convenient source of information for the war. In the Hogwarts kitchens, dozens of house elves worked tirelessly. Dobby, the most famous of them, had been freed only through Harry's trick with Lucius Malfoy's sock, not through any systematic reform. When Dobby came to Hogwarts for work, he insisted on being paid, a radical idea among elves. Dumbledore accommodated Dobby's demand, offering him wages and time off, a gesture often cited as proof of his kindness. Yet it was the bare minimum, a single elf granted rights only because he demanded them. The tea? Rest continued unpaid, their bondage unremarked. Even Dobby's freedom was achieved by the compassion of Harry Potter, not the grand designs of the headmaster who controlled the school. Hogwarts was supposed to be a refuge for all magical beings. The centaurs of the Forbidden Forest were offered uneasy coexistence, and giants were recruited in a desperate bid to counter Voldemort's forces, but for House Elves, the castle itself was a gilded prison. In Order of the Phoenix, when Hermione questions why elves serve without pay, Ron responds dismissively that they like it, an attitude Dumbledore never challenges. The headmaster could have used his vast moral authority to question these beliefs, but he chose silence. He, who urged love as the most powerful magic, ignored the possibility that love must be freely given to matter at all. Hermione's cause, often dismissed as naive, was the only real resistance to this ancient injustice seen at Hogwarts. She braved ridicule from her friends, who found her crusade absurd. But she was right about the central fact. The elves were coerced. Their magic punished disobedience automatically. Even Winky, who cried and drank herself into a stupor after being freed, was a testament to how deeply their servitude was bred into them. Not natural love of work, but indoctrination enforced by magical means. Dumbledore, with all his understanding of the human mind and soul, surely saw this, that he chose not to act as a stain on his moral legacy. When Harry asked Dumbledore about Kreacher in Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore admitted he had overlooked the elf. He called it a serious mistake, one that cost Sirius his life. It was a rare moment of self-reproach, but even then he framed it as a tactical error rather than an ethical failure. He regretted Kreacher's betrayal for its consequences, not for Kreacher's suffering. The elves of Hogwarts remained out of mind, still labouring in the kitchens, still bound. Dumbledore's apology was personal, limited to his relationship with Sirius, and left the broader system of enslavement untouched. It is difficult to imagine that the man who defeated Grindelwald could not have altered Hogwarts' employment practices had he truly wanted to. He overruled the ministry on countless matters, refused Dolores Umbridge's decrees, and protected students like Harry from expulsion. But in the case of the elves, he acted as though he had no power at all, claiming they were happy. Perhaps he truly believed it, or perhaps he found the cost of change too high. Free elves might not want to work at Hogwarts, meals might be harder to conjure. In that sense, his inaction suggests a quiet complicity, a willingness to benefit from an unjust system so long as it kept the school running smoothly. The paradox of Dumbledore is that he was brilliant enough to understand people's motivations in the finest detail, yet seemed willfully blind to the reality of the elves' condition. He understood Tom Riddle's need for love, Snape's tortured loyalty, Harry's burden as a Horcrux, but when it came to Kreacher's cleaning his floors, he accepted the easy answer. He was not a cruel man in the usual sense, but perhaps he was indifferent in the way of people who benefit from inequality without confronting it. This is the darkness that haunted even his shining legend, the flaw he might have acknowledged if anyone had pressed him hard enough. The House Elves' magic was not simply service but self-punishment. They were compelled to harm themselves when they disobeyed, a brutal form of magical conditioning. Dobby nearly killed himself to warn Harry in Chamber of Secrets, bashing his head and ironing his hands. Dumbledore was aware of such practices. He understood the magic better than anyone alive, but never considered how monstrous it was to allow it in his own school. Hogwarts was a sanctuary for many, but for House Elves it was a workshop of invisible pain, where their bruises were hidden behind enchanted walls and their cries muffled by generations of tradition. Even in death, Dumbledore's failure lingered. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione were on the run in Deathly Hallows, they buried Dobby with respect and gratitude. It was a tiny act of rebellion against the system Dumbledore never dismantled. Harry's grief at Dobby's grave was the acknowledgement of the elf's personhood that Dumbledore, for all his wisdom, never fully granted. Dobby had to earn freedom himself, had to demand wages and clothing, had to die in service to his friends before wizards would see his dignity. It is telling that the final tribute to an elf came not from the headmaster who led a school for decades, but from the boy he trained to be better than himself. Some have argued Dumbledore was a realist, that he could not change everything at once, but this claim ignores his own words about love and moral courage. In Philosopher's Stone, he tells Harry, "It takes a great deal of bravery to stand up to our enemies, but just as much to stand up to our friends." Perhaps he should have added, or to our traditions. He was unafraid to stand up to Voldemort, but unwilling to confront the institution that kept Hogwarts' meals hot and its floors polished. He tolerated the status quo because it was convenient, or because he believed he knew better than the elves themselves what they wanted. Hermione Granger, barely 14, saw the truth Dumbledore ignored. She recognized that being forced to love work is not the same as wanting it freely. She saw that liberty is not just the right to be free, but the power to choose. Dumbledore's smile at her efforts was the worst kind of condescension, that of a man too clever to admit being wrong. He called her kind but misguided while doing nothing himself. His inaction taught generations of students that the elves' slavery was normal. In the end, the great reformer left the castle just as he found it, with hundreds of elves bowing low in the steam-filled kitchens. The tragedy is not that Dumbledore was a villain in disguise, but that he was a good man who failed in a crucial way. His shade of darkness was not sadism, but the soft tyranny of benevolent neglect. He could forgive nearly anything but disruption of the order he cherished. He valued peace, even an unjust peace. And so the House Elves remained unseen, their story written between the lines of Hogwarts history, a footnote in the lives of wizards who should have known better. When we speak of Dumbledore's wisdom, it is incomplete without this reckoning. He taught Harry about sacrifice, loyalty, and love's power over death, yet never grasped that love cannot grow where freedom does not exist. The elves were denied that freedom every day of his long tenure. He who spoke of the greater good in the fight against Grindelwald forgot to apply the same standard to those serving at his feet. His legacy is magnificent but flawed, a monument built on quiet injustice that no spell could cleanse. Number 18, using Dumbledore's army. When Dolores Umbridge rose to power at Hogwarts, transforming the castle into an oppressive fortress of decrees and punishments, Albus Dumbledore did not intervene as many had hoped he would. He stood apart, the silent architect of resistance. Within the concealed walls of the Room of Requirement, a band of students gathered to learn what their professors no longer dared to teach. They called themselves Dumbledore's Army, a name that spoke volumes about their purpose and allegiance. It was not merely an act of youthful defiance, it was the manifestation of an unspoken pact between mentor and pupils. Dumbledore was fully aware of these secret lessons. He did not simply tolerate them, he enabled them. His eyes, which so often twinkled with benevolence, now reflected a darker calculation. When Harry Potter returned to his office to report their progress, Dumbledore never voiced disapproval. Rather, he looked satisfied, as if each incantation mastered was another piece set upon his strategic chessboard. In the shadows of Umbridge's regime, Dumbledore allowed children to become soldiers. It was Hermione Granger who proposed the group in the first place, compelled by her growing horror that defense against the dark arts had become a hollow charade. She understood that knowledge was survival, yet Hermione's brilliance did not diminish the ethical complexity of their cause. Ron Weasley, whose hand trembled when he first attempted a shield charm, would later perform the same spell in real combat against Death Eaters. The path from theory to practice, from school to a battlefield, was shorter than any of them imagined. Dumbledore knew precisely how short. He knew that Voldemort would soon rise openly, and that no sanctuary would remain untouched. Some might argue he had no choice but to sanction their secret education, but the reality remains that he allowed adolescents to train for war, not simply to protect themselves, but to serve a cause they did not yet fully comprehend. One cannot ignore the moment when Neville Longbottom, the shy boy whose greatest fear was failure, stood at the front of the room practicing the disarming charm. Under Harry's guidance, he whispered, "Expelliarmus," again and again, until the wand flew from Ginny Weasley's grasp. The triumph in Neville's eyes was genuine, but behind it lay an unsettling truth. Dumbledore had planted the seeds of militant discipline in children who had scarcely tasted adulthood. It is too simple to call it noble. It is too comfortable to declare it necessary. For all his wisdom and moral authority, Dumbledore was not above manipulating the innocence of youth. He let their righteous indignation harden into readiness for battle. He watched them grow accustomed to danger, all the while knowing that some would never return from the war he anticipated. Harry's own recollections betray the tension between admiration and unease. In Order of the Phoenix, he admitted to himself that the meetings were the only time he felt truly alive, truly useful during that year of constant frustration. Dumbledore, ever the strategist, must have understood the intoxicating power of purpose over a young mind. He did not simply protect the DA from discovery, he allowed it to flourish, knowing it would strengthen their resolve. It is hard to avoid the conclusion that this was not an accident of circumstance but a deliberate shaping of the next generation's warriors. Dumbledore's famed compassion did not preclude a readiness to sacrifice others' childhoods if it served a greater end. There is the detail of how Dobby, the house elf, warned them each time Umbridge approached, evidence that Dumbledore had arranged more than plausible deniability. He had woven a protective net, a silent endorsement of their activities. When Marietta Edgecombe betrayed them, Dumbledore took the blame himself, declaring to Fudge and Umbridge that it was his army and no one else's. His words were, "You seem to be labouring under the delusion that I am going to, what is the phrase, come quietly." This defiance cemented his legend, but it also confirmed that he considered the DA his instrument. He was willing to claim ownership because, in truth, it was his design all along. Even Luna Lovegood, whose airy manner concealed a steely core, was swept into this current. She had never been popular, never been included, until Dumbledore's army made her part of something larger. It was belonging, yes, but also conscription under another name. Each child who entered that hidden room was given knowledge they could never unlearn. They were shown that spells could break bones, that shields could save lives, that they alone stood between their world and the darkness gathering at the threshold. In that way, Dumbledore's army was both empowerment and indoctrination. One cannot help recalling how Ginny, barely 15, practiced the Bat-Bogey Hex with a grim satisfaction that went beyond school rivalry. She was preparing herself to fight real enemies, to inflict real harm if necessary. This was not abstract theory, it was preparation for war, and Dumbledore never lifted a finger to stop it. Perhaps he believed there was no time left for innocence. Perhaps he was right, but there is still a difference between defending the vulnerable and shaping them into combatants. The line is slender, almost invisible, and Dumbledore stepped across it. The records of the Wizengamot would never accuse him of such a thing. The public adored the myth of the kindly headmaster. Yet those who stood in the room of requirement saw the other face of Albus Dumbledore, a man who believed the ends could justify almost any means. If he had intervened, insisted they study only non-violent spells, the DA would have become a study group rather than a clandestine militia. But he did not. He let the name stand, Dumbledore's army. He let them conjure patronuses and stunners and disarming charms, knowing they would one day use them in life-or-death battles. There is something chilling in how easily the students adapted. Dean Thomas, who had never held a wand with confidence, became adept at stunning charms. Cho Chang, still grieving Cedric Diggory, turned her sorrow into grim purpose. This alchemy of grief into resolve, uncertainty into violence, was something Dumbledore understood better than anyone. He did not force them, but he did not stop them. The distinction matters little to the moral cost. In the end, he watched them turn into soldiers beneath the flickering torchlight. If you read the text closely, you can sense the unspoken approval in Harry's recollection of Dumbledore's eyes. When the DA was exposed, Dumbledore's reaction was not outrage at their recklessness, but pride in their loyalty. This, too, is revealing. He had been grooming them not merely to survive, but to resist, to defy, to fight. "You are protected, in short, by your ability to love," he told Harry later. Yet that love was forged in a crucible of fear and fury, and Dumbledore did not hesitate to stoke the flames when it served his cause. Consider the lesson of the room itself. It would transform to meet their needs, becoming a secret dojo of resistance. Dumbledore could have sealed that room. He could have forbidden its use. Instead, he allowed it to stand as an incubator for the coming rebellion. In doing so, he became something more complicated than the wise old mentor. He became the silent general of a youth army, an architect of child soldiers in the name of a higher good. Even after Dumbledore's death, the legacy of his decision persisted. The DA was reborn under Neville's leadership when Snape and the Carrows took control. The children Dumbledore once encouraged to practice disarming charms were now sabotaging Death Eater operations, setting traps, smuggling wands to the desperate. This continuity speaks to how deeply he had embedded the idea that resistance was their destiny. It is tempting to admire this foresight, to call it heroic. Yet it also reveals how far he was willing to go to prepare them for war, even if it cost them the last fragments of their innocence. The price was not abstract. Colin Creevey, the boy who once idolized Harry with shining eyes, died in the Battle of Hogwarts. He died fighting the war Dumbledore had prepared him for. Perhaps no one could have spared him, perhaps he would have fought anyway, but it was Dumbledore who first sanctioned the notion that children must be ready to duel for their lives. When we look at Colin's body in the Great Hall, we are forced to ask whether any cause, no matter how just, is worth that sacrifice. Number 19. The death of Ariana, his heavy burden. Albus Dumbledore, in the quiet hours of the night, often found himself haunted by the memory of Ariana's pale face, the way her body had lain still, robbed of the fragile peace he had promised to protect. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, he confessed that her death was the result of his own arrogant ambition. He admitted to Harry Potter with a weariness that suggested he had rehearsed the same confession in his mind countless times. "I resented it, Harry. I was gifted. I was brilliant. I wanted to escape. I wanted to shine. I wanted glory." The weight of those words lingered between them, but even that rare moment of candor could not erase the decades he had spent carefully cultivating the image of a wise, benevolent leader. Instead of retreating into obscurity and dedicating his life to repentance, Dumbledore stepped further into the center of magical Britain, claiming positions of influence that no other wizard could rival. When he became headmaster of Hogwarts, many celebrated it as the natural consequence of genius tempered by goodness. Yet beneath the surface there was the quiet, unspoken truth that he was a man who had once believed himself worthy to remake the world, even if it meant wielding power over countless lives. His alliance with Gellert Grindelwald forged in the shimmering summer after Hogwarts, was not merely a youthful misjudgment, but a declaration of ambition that had cost his sister her life. Matilda Bagshot later spoke of how Albus and Gellert were inseparable, plotting in hushed tones about a revolution that would raise wizards above Muggles for the greater good. The tragedy of Ariana ended those dreams, but the appetite for influence never entirely left him. Throughout his long career, Dumbledore wrapped himself in the robes of a mentor. He was the wise protector who guided Harry against Voldemort, the subtle architect of plans that stretched across decades. But in doing so, he withheld truths that could have prepared Harry more honestly for the cost of destiny. He did not share the full story of Ariana's death until he had no choice, and even then it was offered as an aside, a footnote to his confessions of past mistakes. To the public and to many of his colleagues, he remained the epitome of virtue, while privately he nursed a guilt that he could never bring himself to expose completely. This duality is what made his character so tragically human, a man too ashamed to admit he had once been willing to trade his sister's well-being for a dream of conquest. In The Life and Lies of Albus Dumbledore, Rita Skeeter delighted in painting him as a manipulator who concealed more than he ever revealed. Though much of Skeeter's book was laced with sensationalism, she was not wrong to suspect that his reluctance to speak of Ariana was rooted in more than grief. The death of a sister might have broken another man's ambitions permanently, but Dumbledore instead redoubled his efforts to control the direction of wizarding society. He joined the Wizengamot, presided over the International Confederation of Wizards, and finally accepted the headship of Hogwarts as if determined to prove that the darkness within him could be offset by a lifetime of service. The burden of that guilt expressed itself in peculiar ways. Dumbledore's refusal to become Minister for Magic was often presented as a sign of modesty, but it was also a tacit acknowledgement that he could not be trusted with unrestrained authority. He knew how easily he had been seduced by visions of domination when he was young, yet he still shaped the lives of generations of students and remained the de facto moral compass of the magical world. One could argue that he never relinquished the same control he once craved alongside Grindelwald. He merely redirected it into more socially acceptable channels. This complicated legacy was something Dumbledore rarely allowed others to glimpse. Even Aberforth, who had never forgiven him for Ariana's death, remained on the fringes of his brother's carefully constructed life. In the Hog's Head, Aberforth once spat bitterly that Albus had cared more for grand plans than for family, and in that raw condemnation lay a truth Dumbledore never denied outright. He simply could not face it without crumbling. When Harry confronted him in the portrait in Deathly Hallows, Dumbledore finally admitted how deeply he regretted Ariana's fate, calling it the most terrible tragedy of my life. But the confession came only after death had freed him from the need to maintain appearances. The carefully managed image of Dumbledore as the unerring sage left little room for vulnerability. To Harry he had been a guide and protector, but also a keeper of secrets so vast that they might have undone the boy's trust altogether. In The Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore told Harry that it was the unknown we fear when we look upon death and darkness, yet he himself had spent a lifetime fearing the darkness of his own past more than any foe. He never told Harry that the pursuit of power could begin with noble intentions and end in unimaginable ruin. Instead, he left Harry to learn that lesson in fragments, pieced together long after Dumbledore himself was gone. The secrecy surrounding Ariana's death was more than personal shame. It was also a shield against public scrutiny. Had the wizarding world understood the full depth of his complicity, they might never have entrusted him with the authority he wielded so effortlessly. The portrait of Dumbledore that hung in the headmaster's office was serene, the eyes twinkling as though amused by some private joke. But the real man had wept over Ariana's body and carried the stain of that day into every triumph and every failure. His reluctance to confess was not mere pride. It was the fear that everything he had built would collapse if the truth were ever fully illuminated. Even in his final acts, Dumbledore's decisions were tinged with the same contradiction. He orchestrated his own death, arranging with Severus Snape to die on the battlements of Hogwarts. This plan, while pragmatic, was also another attempt to control the narrative, to ensure that his departure would serve a larger purpose rather than appear as the natural consequence of his human frailty. He left Harry the task of defeating Voldemort, but withheld the knowledge of the Hallows and the complete story of his own obsession with them. As a boy, he had dreamed of uniting the Deathly Hallows to conquer death itself. As an old man, he could not bring himself to share the whole tale, perhaps fearing that Harry would see how easily greatness could curdle into selfishness. Dumbledore's relationship with power was never as simple as it appeared. He had glimpsed what it meant to hold destiny in one's hands, and had recoiled when that destiny demanded a sacrifice he could never undo. In many ways, he spent the rest of his life trying to atone without ever fully confessing, offering the fruits of his intellect to the world, but never inviting it to look too closely at the cost. Even those who loved him, like Minerva McGonagall, never heard the unvarnished story. He gave them fragments, hints of sorrow, flashes of regret, but the full truth was locked away in his own remorseful heart. The death of Ariana was a wound that never healed. Dumbledore himself admitted as much in his final conversation with Harry when he said, "I was unworthy to unite them, to hold the Elder Wand, to deserve the Resurrection Stone." His recognition of that unworthiness did not stop him from pursuing influence wherever it could be made to serve a purpose. The contradiction was both tragic and illuminating, a man determined to protect others from the same mistakes, even as he continued to exercise the very power that had once destroyed his family. In the end, Dumbledore's story is a cautionary tale about the allure of greatness and the price of secrets. His silence about Ariana was never truly benign. It was a choice that allowed him to continue shaping the world without ever having to answer fully for his past. He was neither wholly a hero nor entirely a villain, but something more complex. A man who tried to build a better world while never fully escaping the shadow of his own ambition. Number 20. Neglecting wand makers like Gregorovitch and Ollivander. Albus Dumbledore, the revered headmaster of Hogwarts, held the secrets of countless lives in his slender hands, but few understood just how selectively he dispensed his care. His approach to wand law during the Second Wizarding War remains an unsettling testament to his contradictions, for while he proclaimed the value of every ally, he cast aside Gregorovitch and treated Ollivander with an indifference that only later transformed into desperate interest. There was a darkness in this partiality, an unsettling willingness to let craftsmen of supreme importance fend for themselves until the hour was too late to pretend benevolence. As Voldemort's shadow lengthened across Europe, the lives of these wandmakers became mere footnotes in Dumbledore's grand strategy, worthy of rescue or recognition only when their knowledge could no longer be ignored. Gregorovitch, the famed Eastern European wandmaker, was first introduced to readers through Victor Crumb's casual acknowledgement that he had crafted the young champion's wand. "My wand is made by Gregorovitch," Crumb had declared in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, yet the older wizard's fate was never of concern to the British magical establishment. Dumbledore knew of Gregorovitch's claim to have once possessed the Elder Wand, an artifact of such destructive legend that it might have altered the course of the war if properly tracked and controlled. However, rather than approaching Gregorovitch as a partner or even as a man to be protected from Voldemort's inevitable hunt, Dumbledore simply turned away, his attention fixed elsewhere. The omission was not accidental. It was a calculated gamble that Gregorovitch's fate would not interfere with the headmaster's own designs for the Elder Wand's destiny. Years passed in this dismissive silence. Gregorovitch grew old in obscurity, perhaps suspecting that dark forces were inching toward him. His workshop, once a place of innovation, became a secluded den of dwindling business and unspoken fear. When Voldemort finally came, there was no protection from Hogwarts, no discreet intervention from the Order of the Phoenix. Grigorovich was interrogated, humiliated, and finally murdered. Just another body laid. Across the threshold of the Dark Lord's ambition. The man's death was recounted with chilling brevity. Grigorovich was dead. No lamentation followed, no reflection from Dumbledore's successors about what might have been prevented if the old wand-maker had not been left to his fate. It was an omission that revealed a troubling kernel of Dumbledore's pragmatism. The knowledge Grigorovich once possessed mattered more than the life that contained it. Ollivander's plight is a more familiar tragedy. The greatest British wand-maker, the man who had fitted thousands of wizards and witches with the tools of their magical identity, was abducted from his Diagon Alley shop in the summer of 1996. The event was catastrophic, a direct strike against a cornerstone of the wizarding world's heritage. Yet even in the aftermath, there is no record of Dumbledore mounting a mission to retrieve Ollivander. Instead, the headmaster's response was cool acceptance, as though the abduction were an inevitable inconvenience rather than an existential threat to their collective defense. Ollivander was left to endure months of captivity, tortured for the secrets of wand mastery, the lore of cause and woods, and above all, the hidden tale of the Elder Wand's passage through history. Only when Voldemort began to act upon the information he had gleaned did Dumbledore's interest sharpen into real urgency. The irony was that Dumbledore, perhaps more than any other wizard alive, understood that wand lore was not merely an academic pursuit, but the hinge upon which victory might swing. He was intimately acquainted with the Elder Wand's legend, as recorded in the Tales of Beedle the Bard, and he had dedicated years to studying the nuances of ownership and allegiance. Yet he withheld this context from the very craftsmen who could have been his greatest allies. It is difficult to reconcile this with his reputation as a champion of cooperation and trust. Some might argue that to share the truth with Ollivander or Grigorovich would have placed them in still greater danger. But when danger found them anyway, when they were left to be broken by Voldemort's relentless curiosity, it is hard not to wonder if the real calculation was simpler. They were only valuable when their suffering had yielded information that Dumbledore could no longer afford to ignore. This perspective casts a long shadow over the final months of Dumbledore's life. He spent that time mentoring Harry, orchestrating Snape's role as a double agent, and gathering fragments of Voldemort's past. But not once did he organize a coordinated effort to recover Ollivander, or to reach out to Grigorovich before Voldemort did. Even the search for the Elder Wand was cloaked in ambiguity, as though Dumbledore were less concerned with stopping Voldemort from acquiring it than with controlling the timing of that inevitable confrontation. In Deathly Hallows, the moment when Harry learns that Dumbledore possessed the Elder Wand all along feels less like a triumph and more like a confession. Dumbledore had the Elder Wand, Harry thought, bewildered, realizing that the old man's caution had never been total honesty. The wand-makers were pawns in this hidden war, pieces that could be sacrificed if it meant prolonging Dumbledore's advantage. Ollivander's rescue came not through Dumbledore's initiative, but through the efforts of Dobby and the friends who stormed Malfoy Manor. Even then, the wand-maker's recovery was incomplete. He was frail, haunted by torture, and burdened by the guilt of having revealed the Elder Wand's rumoured journey from Grigorovich to Gellert Grindelwald. In the grim quiet of Shell Cottage, Ollivander whispered the final truth, that Voldemort would not rest until the wand was his. Dumbledore, for all his foresight, had left Ollivander in this position of anguish. His earlier inaction meant that Ollivander's memories had been exploited, his body ravaged by pain that could have been prevented. There is a striking contrast in how Dumbledore spoke of protecting Hogwarts, its children, its heritage, its values, and how he acted toward these two men who held the keys to wand lore. To a headmaster who prized learning, the neglect of such vital craftsmen seems almost unthinkable unless one admits that he believed their suffering was, in a sense, useful. Voldemort's desperation to control the Elder Wand flushed out information that even Dumbledore could not have extracted without risking exposure. The cost of this knowledge was measured not in Dumbledore's own sacrifices, but in the lives and sanity of Gregorovitch and Ollivander. When viewed through this lens, the headmaster's conduct begins to look less like benign oversight and more like a deliberate gamble with other people's pain. This cynical thread also runs through Dumbledore's handling of other alliances. He manipulated Snape's loyalty with Lily Potter's memory, he steered Harry toward martyrdom without ever revealing the complete truth, and he expected others to play their parts in his silent war against Voldemort. Ollivander and Gregorovitch were simply two more pieces in this pattern. The notion that Dumbledore was purely altruistic becomes harder to defend when one examines the methodical way he prioritized the Elder Wand's secrecy over the dignity of the men who understood it best. He was, in the end, a strategist before he was a friend. Even in death, Dumbledore's legacy is stained by these choices. As Harry pieced together the wand's history, he could not help but feel the chill of betrayal. He had known all along, Harry realized, recognizing that Dumbledore's warnings about power were grounded in first-hand experience of wielding the most powerful wand in existence. This revelation did not erase Dumbledore's wisdom or his heroism, but it did expose the shade of darkness that lurked beneath his serenity, the same darkness that permitted him to ignore Gregorovitch until he was dead and to leave Ollivander to the mercy of torturers. It is worth remembering that Ollivander never expressed resentment. When Harry visited him in Shell Cottage, the old wand-maker only looked haunted, not bitter. Yet this absence of anger does not absolve the choices that placed him there. Dumbledore's refusal to act preemptively left Ollivander at Voldemort's mercy, and when rescue finally came, it was too late to spare him from lasting scars. The question remains, if Dumbledore had intervened sooner, would Voldemort's pursuit of the Elder Wand have unfolded differently? Would Gregorovitch have survived? Would the Dark Lord have been denied the knowledge that ultimately led to the final duel in Hogwarts' Great Hall? Dumbledore once told Harry, "It is our choices that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities." These words ring hollow when set against his own record with the Wandmakers. For all his brilliance and compassion, he made a choice to ignore them until they became essential to his strategy. Their lives were weighed against the abstract cause of victory, and their suffering became a necessary cost in his calculus. In that there was an undeniable tinge of darkness, the quiet admission that even the greatest of wizards can treat human beings as expendable when the stakes are high enough. Number 21. Death as a tool. Albus Dumbledore was widely celebrated as the wise and compassionate headmaster of Hogwarts, the champion of good who stood in Voldemort's way, but a closer examination of his actions reveals something darker, something unsettling beneath the twinkle in his eye and the reassuring voice. He claimed death was but the next great adventure, words he spoke with comforting gravity to Harry, to his students, to his allies, even to himself. Yet his actions expose a man who treated the deaths of others as necessary steps in a grand design, whose intellect and strategy were matched only by his willingness to sacrifice pawns for what he saw as the greater good. The story of James and Lily Potter stands as the first testament to this unsettling aspect of Dumbledore. When he learned of the prophecy that Voldemort would seek to kill Harry, he did not evacuate them to safety outside Britain, nor did he directly challenge Voldemort then and there. Instead, he recommended the Fidelius Charm, a powerful spell, yes, but one whose failure would cost them their lives. When Sirius offered to be secret keeper, Dumbledore did not oversee the arrangement carefully. He left them to their fate, and when Peter Pettigrew betrayed them, he reacted not with fury at his own laxity, but with grim acceptance. "You did well to tell me this," he said to Harry, about the prophecy in the 6th book, treating the revelation as a strategic tool rather than acknowledging the human cost of its existence. There was an undeniable coldness in the way Dumbledore approached the deaths of James and Lily. He spoke of their sacrifice as noble, meaningful, necessary. But did he do enough to prevent it? He was the most powerful wizard of his age, yet he refused the post of Minister for Magic. He declined direct power that might have allowed him to act more forcefully. He let events unfold as if convinced that the shape of destiny was more important than the lives lost to fulfill it. He might say he respected free will, but he also knew full well the prophecy Voldemort sought, and he chose to allow that prophecy to dangle like bait, ensuring Voldemort would mark Harry as his equal. In that sense, he let the Potters become a necessary sacrifice in the shaping of the Chosen One, as if they were characters in a play whose deaths served the plot he wished to see. The example of Sirius Black also exposes Dumbledore's unsettling pragmatism. After the Potters' deaths, Sirius was imprisoned without trial, the convenient scapegoat for Pettigrew's betrayal. Dumbledore, brilliant and politically connected, did nothing. He did not demand a fair trial, did not use his influence to press for evidence. For 12 years, Sirius rotted in Azkaban while the real traitor lived freely. It is possible Dumbledore suspected the truth. The man was rarely surprised after all. But whether or not he knew, he chose inaction. And when Sirius escaped and returned to Harry's life, Dumbledore once again failed to secure him freedom or safety. Instead, Sirius was forced to hide, restless and angry, until he died at the Department of Mysteries. Harry's godfather, the last link to his parents, died fighting to protect the boy who was the center of Dumbledore's strategy, a casualty Dumbledore mourned in words but seemed to have planned for in deeds. Dumbledore's relationship with Harry is perhaps the most damning evidence of this dark shade in his philosophy. He knew from the beginning that Harry was a Horcrux, that the boy would have to die for Voldemort to be defeated, yet he raised him like a lamb for slaughter. "I cared more for your happiness than your knowing the truth," he confessed in Deathly Hallows, words that seem compassionate on the surface, but mask the harsh reality. He was grooming Harry to accept death when the time came. He did not tell Harry until it was too late for any other plan. He did not seek a way to remove the Horcrux safely. He simply accepted Harry's necessary death as part of the design, ensuring the boy would walk willingly to his doom. In Half-Blood Prince, he even says, "You are the 7th Horcrux." He did not say it as an apology. He said it as a fact to be accepted. And in planning his own death, Dumbledore displayed a chilling sense of control that he denied to others. He insisted that Snape kill him, not because he accepted his own mortality with grace, but because he wanted to ensure Draco Malfoy's soul remained unstained, to preserve the trust of Voldemort, to control every detail of the narrative. He made his death into an act of strategic value, removing himself as an obstacle while guaranteeing Voldemort's trust in Snape. It was a masterstroke of manipulation, but also the act of a man who saw death not as the end of life, but as a tool on the chessboard. His own death was planned with meticulous care. Others' deaths were, at best, loose ends in need of trimming. Even Snape, the man Dumbledore trusted most, was not exempt from this cold calculus. Dumbledore demanded of him the most unforgivable act: murder. Snape was forced to carry the guilt of killing his mentor and protector, of being branded the murderer of the greatest wizard of the age. Dumbledore assured Snape that it was for the greater good, but it was Snape who had to bear the stain, Snape who had to continue living with the weight of it, Snape who had to lie to Voldemort, to the Order, to himself. And when Snape expressed reluctance, Dumbledore pressed him with calm authority, saying in Half-Blood Prince, "You must be the one to kill me, Severus. It is the only way." He made it sound inevitable, but he designed the inevitability himself. There is also the matter of the prophecy itself. Dumbledore told Harry that neither can live while the other survives, but he withheld the full implications for years. He let Harry believe he might survive, let him dream of victory without sacrifice. He chose the moment of revelation carefully, only when there was no turning back. It was a calculated act of psychological manipulation, one designed to ensure Harry would walk to his death willingly when the time came. Dumbledore did not demand Harry's death outright. He arranged circumstances so Harry would choose it himself, believing it to be the right thing. He turned Harry's own courage and nobility into weapons against him, a sacrifice the boy made without truly understanding the forces that pushed him. Dumbledore's famous words about death. To the well-organized mind, death is but the next great adventure, ring hollow in the light of his actions. He was willing to philosophize about death when it was abstract, but when real people died because of his choices, he did not shrink from the price. Instead, he rationalized it as necessary. Lily and James Potter, Sirius Black, Alastair Moody, Dobby, Fred Weasley, Remus Lupin, Nymphadora Tonks, all casualties of a war he directed from afar. He mourned them in private, no doubt, but his strategic vision always came first. He did not see them as disposable, perhaps, but he accepted their deaths with a kind of resigned approval, viewing them as proof of the correctness of his plan. There is a haunting moment in Deathly Hallows when Harry meets Dumbledore at King's Cross. Dumbledore admits, "I was afraid that I had cared more for your happiness than your knowing the truth." But he also tells Harry that he expected him to die, that he knew it was necessary. It is a moment of tragic honesty, but it is also a confession of manipulation. Dumbledore's fear was not that Harry would die, it was that Harry would die without understanding why. He wanted Harry to see his own death as noble, meaningful, the ultimate sacrifice. And so he coached him, prepared him, made sure the boy would not run from the fate Dumbledore had designed for him. Dumbledore's treatment of Harry at Privet Drive is another troubling facet of this philosophy. He left the child with the Dursleys, knowing they would abuse and neglect him because he believed it would build Harry's resilience and keep him humble. He ensured the blood protection would guard Harry from Voldemort, yes, but at the cost of the boy's childhood. He allowed Harry to grow up unloved, friendless, mistreated, shaping him into the kind of self-sacrificing hero who would accept death when the time came. He saw the cruelty of the Dursleys as part of the plan, necessary suffering to mold the weapon he needed. Consider also the way Dumbledore treated the Order of the Phoenix. He kept secrets from them, used them as tools. He did not share everything he knew about Voldemort's Horcruxes, about the Elder Wand, about Harry's role. He parceled out knowledge carefully, ensuring no one could disrupt the plan he had devised. He trusted them to fight and die for him, but he did not trust them with the truth. Even when Mad-Eye Moody died, Dumbledore's plan rolled on, the death of the most vigilant Auror written off as the cost of doing business. They were all pieces on his board, moved carefully toward an endgame only he could see. And when one considers the Deathly Hallows themselves, Dumbledore's hypocrisy becomes undeniable. He once sought them himself, driven by youthful arrogance and ambition, believing he might master death. After his sister's death, he claimed to have learned humility, to have renounced power. Yet he kept the resurrection stone hidden in the snitch, ensuring Harry would use it when walking to his own death. He claimed he no longer sought to master death, but he continued to treat it as a tool to be wielded, not a mystery to be respected. He made sure Harry would see his parents, his lost loved ones, before dying, an act of psychological engineering as much as comfort. The truth is that Dumbledore was not cruel for cruelty's sake. He was not Voldemort. He did not revel in death or pain, but he believed that death was acceptable if it served the greater good. He viewed life through the lens of strategy, sacrifice, and necessary loss. He made himself the grandmaster of a deadly game, convinced that only he could see the right moves. In the end, this philosophy may have defeated Voldemort, but it also left a trail of corpses and broken lives, the collateral damage of a man who saw death not as the end of life, but as the price of victory. Dumbledore's shade of darkness is thus not found in sadism or hatred, but in moral certainty. He believed himself wise enough to decide who must live and who must die, who deserved the truth and who could be lied to, who should be protected and who could be sacrificed. In Deathly Hallows he admits to Harry, "I cared more for your happiness than your knowing the truth," but the truth he gave Harry was the one that ensured Harry would die for the cause. His apology rings hollow because it was always conditional. He felt regret, but he never questioned whether the plan itself was wrong. That is the most frightening part of Dumbledore's philosophy. Not that he was cold, but that he was so sure he was right. Number 22, Indifference to Muggle Lives. Albus Dumbledore is often hailed as the great protector of Muggles, a wizard who argued tirelessly against blood purity and fought the very notion that magical blood made anyone superior. Yet when we dig beneath the comforting mythology, we see a man who did startlingly little to shield Muggles from Voldemort's reign of terror. When Death Eaters swept through towns and murdered entire families, merely to send a message, Dumbledore's Order of the Phoenix focused almost exclusively on wizarding targets. It's true that the Order sabotaged Death Eater operations, but there is not one recorded instance in the text of Dumbledore organizing any systemic defense of Muggle communities. When Voldemort rose to power in the First Wizarding War, Muggle deaths spiked, the Ministry of Magic turned a blind eye, and Dumbledore simply worked around them, never truly confronting them about their failure to protect the non-magical majority they were meant to govern. Consider the night the Potters died. The Fidelius charm protected them, a spell of nearly impenetrable secrecy, but it protected only wizards. Muggle neighbours in Godric's Hollow would have been slaughtered without even knowing why, if Voldemort had chosen to vent his fury on them when he failed. Dumbledore knew Voldemort's obsession with blood purity would naturally target Muggles and Muggleborns. He spoke about it repeatedly, but he put all his energy into tracking Horcruxes and the prophecy, ignoring the need for any warning system, safe zones, or even negotiations with the Muggle Prime Minister. "You may call me coward," he told Snape in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, a confession that exposed his private doubts. But cowardice in this context seems less about dying and more about refusing responsibility for an entire population he knew would be slaughtered like cattle. Even the so-called Muggle Protection Act, championed by Arthur Weasley, was a ministry curiosity rather than a serious wartime measure. Dumbledore, as Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, had extraordinary political capital before Voldemort's return. He could have used that influence to push genuine legislation to defend Muggle communities, charms on their villages, Aura patrols near major Muggle cities, coordination with police forces. Instead, he spent decades undermining the ministry politically, partly for good reason, but always with the cost that the wizarding world became more insular, more arrogant in its assumption that Muggles were someone else's problem. Voldemort's campaign against them was treated almost as an afterthought, a PR issue, rather than a crisis demanding a moral reckoning. During the Second Wizarding War, Dumbledore's inaction becomes even more striking. Voldemort was back, confirmed beyond doubt, after Harry duelled him in the graveyard. Yet Dumbledore let the Ministry continue its policy of denial for an entire year, while Muggle deaths mounted. He met with Cornelius Fudge, but when Fudge refused to believe him, Dumbledore simply accepted exile from the Wizengamot and Hogwarts. Bored, rather than try to publicly warn Muggle authorities. There was no open letter, no rogue broadcast, no desperate appeal to the press, magical or Muggle. Even when the Death Eaters began infiltrating the Ministry, he focused on grooming Harry for his final sacrifice and on obtaining Slughorn's memory. Key steps in defeating Voldemort, but steps taken at the cost of ignoring the daily bloodshed of people entirely unable to defend themselves. Look at the Muggle hunting squads the Death Eaters employed, explicitly mentioned in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. They rounded up Muggle-borns but also terrorized Muggle settlements. There is no record of Dumbledore issuing orders to the Order of the Phoenix to protect those communities. The Order's goals remained: keep Harry alive, sabotage Death Eater plots, protect magical targets like the Burrow. Meanwhile, Muggle families disappeared without a trace, their deaths footnotes, in a magical war they didn't even know existed. Even the small gestures, like warning Muggle leaders, seem to have been beneath Dumbledore's notice. The only time we see magical authorities communicate with the Muggle Prime Minister is when Fudge or Scrimgeour visits him to explain damage control after the fact. Dumbledore himself is never shown even considering this necessary, nor can one excuse this negligence as simple ignorance. In Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore says clearly, "Voldemort has gone beyond anything I imagined. He has experimented with the darkest of magic." He knew who Voldemort was, knew his beliefs about Muggles being inferior, and knew what that meant. The books also note that Muggle killings were a deliberate strategy to inspire terror. Yet Dumbledore's strategy was never to limit that terror, only to ensure the final victory over Voldemort himself. In this calculation, every Muggle life was acceptable. Collateral damage. They would die in the hundreds or thousands, while the Order focused on winning a war whose tactics never seriously considered Muggle safety. It's hard to see that as anything but chilling indifference. Consider the contrast with Lily Potter's sacrifice. Lily died to protect her son, a single child, at the cost of her own life. The magic of that act is repeatedly praised as the highest form of love, but Dumbledore himself would not risk even political inconvenience to save entire Muggle towns. He wouldn't challenge the Ministry's cowardly silence directly, at least not in front of Muggle witnesses. He wouldn't share information with the Muggle Prime Minister that might have saved lives. Even the Order of the Phoenix was a clandestine organization focused solely on the wizarding side of the war. It's as if Dumbledore decided that Muggles were beneath his help, pawns to be sacrificed so that Wizarding Society could have its moral victory. In Order of the Phoenix, Dumbledore explains to Harry, "I cared about you too much." He had deliberately kept Harry in the dark to shield him from pain. But that instinct to protect didn't extend to the broader Muggle population. He could barely bring himself to confront his own guilt about Ariana's death, a tragedy that shaped his refusal to seek power openly. Yet he was willing to exert tremendous behind-the-scenes control over the entire wizarding world, crafting an elaborate plan that would kill Harry to destroy Voldemort's soul fragment. For Muggles, there was no plan at all. They were simply forgotten in the high drama of Horcruxes, Elder Wands, and prophecies. When Voldemort's supporters attacked Muggleborns, they forced them to register with the Muggleborn Registration Commission. The entire apparatus was designed to out them, strip them of wands, and in many cases sentence them to death or Azkaban. Dumbledore's order made no attempt to sabotage the commission directly. While they rescued some targets, like Harry from Malfoy Manor, they did not organize a resistance network for Muggleborns in hiding. They didn't hide families, forge documents, or even provide safe passage abroad. The notion of a wizarding underground railroad never materialized. If Arthur Weasley tried anything like that, it went unmentioned and unsupported by Dumbledore. Even Slughorn's memory was obtained with enormous difficulty, a testament to Dumbledore's stubborn determination in some areas. But where was that stubbornness when it came to the Ministry's anti-Muggle lies? When Scrimgeour finally accepted Voldemort was back, he still did nothing to warn the Muggle Prime Minister about possible Death Eater attacks. Dumbledore, who had ample opportunity to meet Scrimgeour after his appointment, seems never to have made it a priority. The result? Muggles died in random, brutal attacks they couldn't have defended against. Even Harry describes the rising wave of terror in Half-Blood Prince, observing that 2 Muggle children had been killed in the park near Little Whinging. Dumbledore's concern was to fetch Harry from Privet Drive, not to shield other Muggle families from the same fate. The most damning evidence lies in Dumbledore's own moral calculations. confessed to Harry in Deathly Hallows via the Pensieve. In King's Cross, he admits, "I was afraid of power." That fear defined his life. He refused leadership roles that might have forced him to take responsibility for everyone, including Muggles. It's easy to see this as humility, but it's also abdication. By refusing the office of Minister for Magic, he left the government in the hands of cowards and incompetents who ignored the genocide of Muggleborns and the slaughter of Muggles. He seemed to believe defeating Voldemort would fix everything, without recognizing that the cost was entire. Communities of innocents butchered in the dark. Even his final plan was ruthlessly pragmatic. He groomed Harry to die, knowing it was necessary. But nowhere in that plan is there mention of protecting Muggles from the chaos sure to follow Voldemort's defeat. Indeed, the Battle of Hogwarts itself could have been an even greater massacre if Voldemort had sent Death Eaters to Muggle towns in retaliation while the Order was pinned at the castle. Dumbledore's genius for strategy simply didn't extend to protecting the non-magical world. He spent years hunting Horcruxes, but didn't organize a single patrol to guard Muggle communities. The Order was fighting for wizarding survival, nothing more. There's a darkness in that omission. Dumbledore saw the big picture. He saw the threat Voldemort posed to the wizarding world's soul. But he didn't see the equally profound threat to the dignity of the wizarding world in allowing Muggles to die by the hundreds without even a warning. This is a man who told Harry that it is our choices that show what we truly are. His choices showed someone willing to sacrifice the innocent for the sake of defeating evil in the abstract, even if that evil left countless graves behind. In that way, he becomes a tragic figure not for the burden he carried, but for the burdens he refused to see at all. Number 23, hiding the truth about Harry's father. Albus Dumbledore was revered for his wisdom and compassion, but in the shadows of his leadership there lingered the quiet stain of deliberate omission. When Harry Potter arrived at Hogwarts fragile with grief and craving belonging, Dumbledore carefully curated every fragment of information about James Potter, ensuring that the boy's perception remained unchallenged. The memory of James as a shining Quidditch star, a loyal friend, and a man who defied Voldemort to protect his family was never balanced with the less flattering truths. In the Pensieve, Harry glimpsed the moment when James dangled Severus Snape upside down, exposing his undergarments to a jeering crowd. The cruelty of that humiliation shimmered in the memory's silvery depths. Yet when Harry confronted Sirius Black and Remus Lupin about the scene, they deflected it as the harmless arrogance of youth. Dumbledore never intervened to correct this narrative, never spoke aloud the plain fact that his father had once been a bully. James Potter's actions were not isolated pranks, but part of a pattern that Severus Snape remembered with searing clarity. The entire wizarding world celebrated James as a hero who defied the Dark Lord, but for Severus, he remained the tormentor who called him Snivelus and left bruises on his pride. Dumbledore, fully aware of these memories, chose to shelter Harry from them. He permitted Harry's illusions to flourish, as if the legend of James Potter mattered more than the reality. A child who had already lost so much deserved the truth, but Dumbledore calculated the weight of that knowledge against his own purposes. It was easier to present James as a shining example of Gryffindor valor, an unblemished ideal for Harry to aspire to, than to risk planting doubts in the boy's loyalty to the so-called light. This subtle manipulation can be glimpsed in the way Dumbledore framed every recollection of the Marauders. He described them as talented young men who fought valiantly against Voldemort, who loved each other with fierce loyalty. Even when Sirius confessed that James had been an arrogant little Burke, it was softened by the reassurance that he matured in time to love Lily Evans. But the truth that James had wielded his wand to humiliate a classmate was never volunteered by Dumbledore himself. He allowed Harry to discover that knowledge by accident, which made the revelation all the more corrosive. In Order of the Phoenix, Harry seethed with resentment. Harry's insides were squirming. The Pensieve had shown him a James Potter he did not recognize. He looked to Dumbledore for clarity, but received none. Dumbledore's silence was not benign. It was a calculated omission to preserve Harry's emotional tether to an idealized father figure. The reality might have shattered the pedestal upon which James Potter stood, replacing admiration with confusion. A boy already burdened by the prophecy, "Neither can live while the other survives," could not be permitted to question whether the side of the light was built upon unacknowledged cruelty. If James Potter was flawed, if the line between bully and savior blurred, then Harry might begin to wonder if the same could be true of Albus Dumbledore himself. And Dumbledore, master strategist that he was, could not risk that question arising too soon. The most telling evidence of this manipulation is that Dumbledore never spoke of James's vendetta against Snape, despite the fact that it would have explained much of Snape's loathing. Harry spent years interpreting Snape's hatred as petty jealousy or unprovoked malice. In reality, Snape's bitterness was not without cause. He had been humiliated, tormented, and publicly degraded by the boy Harry was told to idolize. But that context was never given to him because Dumbledore preferred Harry to believe that Snape was simply a man embittered by darkness, a foil to James's shining heroism. By denying Harry the full picture, Dumbledore ensured his loyalties stayed undivided. It was also convenient for Dumbledore that Harry remained emotionally dependent upon a heroic vision of his father. In The Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore confided in Harry about Voldemort's origins and his own regrets, but still withheld the darker truths about James. There was no confession that James had nearly killed Severus by orchestrating the prank that lured him to the Shrieking Shack, an act only thwarted by Remus Lupin's horror and Severus's accidental rescue. Dumbledore knew this story in every detail. He had confronted the marauders, extracted their reluctant apologies, and sealed the events in secrecy. Yet he never entrusted Harry with this knowledge because it would have revealed James as reckless and cruel, capable of risking a life for the thrill of adolescent power games. Dumbledore's belief that a young boy needed illusions more than truth is both understandable and unsettling. He knew Harry's capacity for compassion and suspected the boy might have felt sympathy for Severus Snape if he had been armed with the entire history. That compassion might have undermined Dumbledore's narrative of clear divisions between good and evil. Perhaps most importantly, it might have weakened Harry's resolve to fight Voldemort. A child who knew that the Order of the Phoenix was not populated by saints might have asked if there were any saints to be found at all. Dumbledore's war demanded certainty, and to preserve that certainty, he hid the uncomfortable parts of the past. One must also consider that Dumbledore had always understood the power of symbols. James Potter was more than a dead father to Harry. He was a legend, a reason to believe that love was stronger than fear, that bravery would triumph over cruelty. A boy who idolized his father would strive to be worthy of that example. This belief had practical benefits. It was simpler to mold Harry into a willing participant in Dumbledore's strategy if the boy felt he was fulfilling a legacy. To shatter that illusion might have left Harry adrift, unmoored from the story that gave him purpose. And so, Dumbledore allowed the legend to stand, though he knew it was incomplete. Yet this choice came with a price. When Harry finally saw James's true face in the pensive, he experienced a breach of trust not only with his father's memory, but with the adults who had guided him. He had been assured again and again that he came from nobility of spirit, that his father was the better man. In truth, James had been cruel to the vulnerable, no better in that moment than the Death Eaters who delighted in suffering. The difference was that James had time to change, to grow into the man Lily loved. But Dumbledore never explained that growth. He only presented the final version and concealed the earlier chapters. Dumbledore's refusal to speak of James's flaws is also a testament to how power can warp even the gentlest intentions. The headmaster who claimed to value truth chose deceit when it suited his aims. The man who told Harry the truth. It is a beautiful and terrible thing, and should therefore be treated with great caution, practiced a brand of caution so extreme it resembled dishonesty. He decided unilaterally which truths Harry could endure, which secrets would be too destructive. In doing so, he assumed ownership of Harry's reality. That is the essence of manipulation, not always the telling of lies, but the deliberate withholding of truths. It is not difficult to imagine that Dumbledore justified his omissions as a kindness. He had spent decades watching young people break under the weight of ugly revelations. Perhaps he believed that Harry, so often wounded, deserved a few illusions to keep his spirit alive, but his calculations were also strategic. He needed Harry willing to sacrifice himself. He needed Harry convinced of the righteousness of their cause. He needed Harry to see Voldemort as the singular embodiment of evil rather than the ultimate expression of the cruelty that lives in all people, including James Potter. The complexity of Dumbledore's motives can be glimpsed in the final moments of Deathly Hallows when he admitted that he had grown to care for Harry more than he should have. That confession is an echo of every decision he made, a man torn between love and expedience. But even in that vulnerable confession, he never spoke plainly of James's darkness. He carried that silence to the end, as if he could not bear to see Harry's faith further corroded. The cost of that choice was that Harry never had the chance to reconcile the father he imagined with the boy James had once been. For the reader, this hidden truth becomes a question of whether Dumbledore's manipulation was necessary. Was it better to let a child believe in a flawless father? Or would it have been kinder and braver to show Harry that even good people can be cruel? In shielding him from this knowledge, Dumbledore created a sanctuary of illusions, but illusions cannot withstand scrutiny forever. The pensive memory shattered them in an instant. In that moment, Harry understood that the bright line between darkness and light was far less certain than Dumbledore wanted him to believe. Number 24. Silent approval of school violence. In the long shadowed halls of Hogwarts, where portraits whispered and torches flickered in eternal twilight, there existed a peculiar tolerance for cruelty that even the most loyal defenders of Albus Dumbledore could not fully deny. From the moment Harry Potter first stepped into the castle, he was thrust into an environment where rivalry teetered on the edge of malice, and where the headmaster's omniscient gaze seemed strangely unwilling to intervene. No clearer example of this unsettling permissiveness appeared than during Harry's 4th year, when Draco Malfoy's incessant provocations culminated in curses cast in corridors and violent skirmishes disguised as harmless pranks. Dumbledore, with all his wisdom and influence, chose to regard these as rites of passage rather than serious transgressions. The records show that even Minerva McGonagall, fierce as she was, could only impose detentions or take a few house points, yet the culture of intimidation flourished unchallenged. It was no secret that Slytherins bore the brunt of collective disdain. The Gryffindors, emboldened by the tales of past heroes, often took it upon themselves to put them in their place. Fred and George Weasley, admired by the school for their humour, were notorious for hexing Slytherin students in the name of harmless fun. The twins once turned Montague into a vanishing cabinet, trapping him between dimensions for days. No record suggests Dumbledore issued a severe reprimand. On the contrary, his leniency emboldened the aggressors, sending a clear message that such acts, though technically forbidden, would be tolerated if they appeared to target the right people. It is striking to note that Dumbledore's silence was, in its own way, a form of tacit approval. Consider the dueling club led by Gilderoy Lockhart during Harry's 2nd year. What began as a demonstration soon devolved into a chaos of hexes and counter-curses. When Harry and Draco faced off, the hall erupted in applause as spells flew, including the Serpensortia curse that conjured a live snake. The crowd's delight was palpable, but the truly revealing moment came afterward, when Dumbledore made no effort to disband the club or to implement safeguards for students too inexperienced to defend themselves. His inaction spoke louder than any speech on discipline. To him, perhaps, it was another opportunity for the children to learn through adversity a philosophy not unlike that of an ancient general preparing soldiers for war. The psychological damage inflicted by this culture was rarely acknowledged. Neville Longbottom, timid and earnest, suffered a steady drip of humiliation that began in childhood and crystallized at Hogwarts. Snape's contempt was the most visible, but the derision of his peers, both subtle and overt, left marks that no wand could heal. When Neville was subjected to the boggart in Lupin's class, it assumed the shape of Professor Snape himself, a testament to years of unchecked cruelty. Yet in all the years Neville struggled under that burden, Dumbledore did not see fit to shield him from such torment or to hold staff accountable for fostering it. Even the house system, which Dumbledore might have reformed, nurtured division rather than unity. The great hall's 4 long tables were more than seating arrangements. They were barriers. Every meal reinforced the idea that loyalty to one's house outweighed empathy for others. The sorting hat itself warned that, though we may belong to different houses, Hogwarts is our home. Yet the headmaster never seriously attempted to dismantle the prejudices that sorting cemented. When Gryffindors and Slytherins traded hexes after Quidditch matches, it was treated as an inevitable side effect of competition, rather than evidence of a failing system. Dumbledore's refusal to address this only deepened the fractures. Remus Lupin, in the days when he was still a student, endured discrimination that everyone pretended not to see. The marauders, James Potter, Sirius Black, Peter Pettigrew, and Remus himself, waged a private war on Severus Snape, culminating in a so-called prank that could have killed him. Dumbledore knew. He admitted as much when he told Harry years later, "I sometimes think we sought too soon." Yet he never imposed true consequences on James and Sirius, and his retrospective regret did nothing to repair the legacy of violence that their impunity encouraged. This, perhaps, was the darkest corner of Dumbledore's character, his willingness to allow children to wound each other under the pretext of growth. Hogwarts' culture of casual violence infected every generation. When Harry and Draco met as first years, their rivalry was not just a clash of personalities, but a continuation of a sanctioned hostility. The professors seldom interrupted insults, and when hexes were hurled in hallways, it was often the victim who faced scrutiny for retaliating. In Harry's 5th year, when Draco and his cronies ambushed him on the Hogwarts Express, the only justice Harry received came from his own spellwork and the intervention of his friends. No teacher appeared to inquire after the incident. No punishment was administered. Dumbledore's eyes, elsewhere as always, saw much but chose little action. Hermione Granger, whose moral compass rarely faltered, was not immune to this dynamic either. Her struggle for acceptance as a Muggle-born was exacerbated by Dumbledore's unwillingness to publicly condemn the ideology that fueled the slurs against her. Mudblood, Draco spat, and though Professor McGonagall assigned detentions, no school-wide declaration of intolerance followed. Dumbledore, who could have stood in the Great Hall and named bigotry for what it was, preferred a softer approach, but softness, in this case, became a form of complicity. Even the Triwizard Tournament, ostensibly an event to promote international cooperation, became a stage for cruelty and terror. Harry's name emerged from the goblet, and the school turned on him with frightening ease. Hufflepuffs, embittered by Cedric Diggory's overshadowing, wore badges proclaiming Potter stinks. None of this escaped Dumbledore's notice. He knew a 14-year-old boy was being vilified for something beyond his control, yet he offered no meaningful protection. His only response was to warn Harry to be cautious, as though caution could deflect the hatred of hundreds. It was not that Dumbledore lacked empathy. On the contrary, he possessed a profound understanding of suffering and human weakness. But in that understanding lay a fatal flaw. He believed that pain was an inevitable instructor. "You will also find that help will always be given at Hogwarts to those who ask for it," he told Harry in the Chamber of Secrets. Yet to ask for help, a child first had to believe it would come. Many never did. They learned instead to endure alone. One must not overlook the irony that Dumbledore, who strove to protect the wizarding world from Voldemort's tyranny, presided over a school whose corridors echoed with the echoes of small tyrannies, children lording over the vulnerable because no one stopped them. Differences of habit and language are nothing at all if our aims are identical and our hearts are open, he said, at the end of Harry's 4th year. Beautiful words, yet they did not erase the truth. At Hogwarts, open hearts were often crushed under the boots of tradition. Perhaps the most haunting evidence of Dumbledore's quiet sanctioning of violence lay in his relationship with Tom Riddle. When Tom was a boy, Dumbledore saw the signs, the cruelty toward fellow orphans, the thirst for domination, and chose not to intervene decisively. He observed, he documented, and he waited. In this waiting, the seeds of Voldemort took root. Decades later, as Harry duelled Voldemort's followers and watched friends die, he must have wondered whether a more vigilant headmaster might have choked that seedling before it grew into darkness. This tolerance extended beyond students to their staff. Severus Snape's bullying of Gryffindors was an open secret. He humiliated Neville, belittled Hermione, and tormented Harry with undisguised contempt. Yet Dumbledore insisted Snape remain in his post, justifying it as a necessary sacrifice in a larger war. What message did that send? That certain cruelties were permissible if they served a higher purpose, that suffering was a price students should pay without complaint. In the end, the portrait of Albus Dumbledore that emerges is not one of a cruel man, but of a leader whose passivity allowed cruelty to flourish unchecked. He believed in second chances, in the power of redemption, in the necessity of struggle, but sometimes struggle only breeds more scars. And in the cold echo of Hogwarts's stone corridors, those scars lingered long after the torches guttered out.